forsaken ward clock struck midnight as Dr. Nathan Holloway made his way down the dimly lit corridor of Blackwood Asylum. The hospital had long been rumored to be haunted, but Nathan never paid attention to such superstitions. He was a man of science, bound by reason. Yet, something about tonight felt different. The power flickered briefly, and a deep chill settled in the air. Nathan ignored it and continued his rounds. As he passed room 306, a soft knocking came from inside. His heart skipped a beat. That room had been sealed for decades after a patient had vanished without a trace. Slowly, he reached for the doorknob. To his surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black room. The only sound was his own breathing, shallow and uneven. Then, a whisper, "Help me, ." Nathan swung his flashlight toward the corner, illuminating a frail figure hunched over. It was a man pale, gaunt, and dressed in tattered hospital garments. His hollow eyes locked onto Nathan's. "They're coming," the man wheezed, before dissolving into mist. Nathan stumbled backward, his rational mind struggling to comprehend what he had just seen. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices chanting in a guttural language. The walls seemed to twist, morphing into something unnatural. Then the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell through darkness, his screams swallowed by the abyss. When he landed, the scent of damp earth filled his nostrils. He was no longer in the hospital. He was in a forest. Towering trees loomed around him, their gnarled branches like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The whispers hadn't stopped. They slithered through the trees, growing closer. Nathan scrambled to his feet and ran. The ground beneath him was soft, almost breathing. Shadows darted between the trees, figures too fast to see clearly. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed forward, hoping for a way out. Ahead, a clearing, a glimmer of hope. But as he reached it, his heart plummeted. In the center of the clearing stood the hospital. It was impossibly out of place, its rotting facade and shattered windows giving it the appearance of an ancient relic. The whispers urged him forward, but his instincts screamed at him to run the other way. Then he saw them. Figures emerged from the trees, faceless, cloaked in shadows, their elongated fingers stretching toward him. One stepped forward, its voice a perfect mimic of the vanished man from room 306. "You never left." Nathan turned to flee, but the forest was gone. The walls of Blackwood Asylum surrounded him once more, yet something was terribly wrong. The air was thick, suffocating. The whispers had become screams. He looked down, his reflection stared back at him from the polished floor, but it wasn't his own. It was the gaunt, hollow-eyed man from room 36, and then, darkness. The vanishing ward Stephen wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished his third cup of coffee. The fluorescent lights of St. Augustine Hospital flickered above him, casting eerie shadows on the pale green walls. It was just past midnight, and the graveyard shift was as dull as always. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional beep of a heart monitor or the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. "Something's wrong with room 206, Claire, one of the night nurses, said as she approached him. Her face was pale, her fingers gripping the tablet tightly. Stephen frowned. 206. That wing has been closed for years. "What do you mean something's wrong?" Claire hesitated. "We've been getting vitals from there, a pulse, oxygen levels, like there's someone inside. But there's no record of a patient, and ... I swear I heard breathing when I walked by." Chill ran down Stephen's spine. He had heard rumors about the abandoned wing. Staff members whispered about strange occurrences, doors locking on their own, ghostly figures seen through the frosted windows, and whispers in the dark. But he had always brushed them off as hospital folklore. "Let's check it out," he said, grabbing his flashlight. The hallway leading to room 206 was unnervingly quiet. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. As Stephen pushed open the door, a wave of cold air rushed past him. The room was dark, except for the blinking green light of a heart monitor. His stomach twisted. The bed was occupied. A man lay motionless, his face obscured by the shadows. Stephen took a cautious step forward. "Sir, are you all right?" The figure slowly turned its head towards him. The movement was unnatural, like bones grinding together. The dim glow of the monitor illuminated hollow, sunken eyes and lips curled into a grotesque smile. "You're too late," the man whispered. The heart monitor flatlined. The room plunged into darkness. Then, the screaming began. Stephen staggered backward, as an unseen force shoved him out of the room. The door slammed shut behind him, the lock clicking into place. From inside, the horrific screams grew louder, warping into a chorus of agonized voices. He turned to Claire, but she was gone. Panic surged through him. He sprinted down the hall, his breath ragged. The hospital had changed. The sterile white walls were now cracked, covered in deep gashes, as if something had clawed through them. The overhead lights flickered erratically, revealing shadowy figures standing motionless at the far end of the corridor. A deafening shriek rang out, and suddenly, the figures lunged forward. Stephen ran. He burst through the emergency exit, expecting to step into the hospital parking lot. Instead, he found himself in a dense forest. The transition was instant, seamless, as if the hospital had never existed. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. Moonlight filtered through the towering trees, casting long, twisting shadows. He turned, but the hospital was gone. "No, no, no," he muttered, spinning in circles. The only sound was his own. Frantic breathing. A branch snapped. Stephen froze. Something moved between the trees. Whispers slithered through the air, incomprehensible and malevolent. Shapes emerged from the darkness, figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. Their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. A low, guttural voice spoke from behind him. "You brought them here. Now they will never leave." Stephen turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Standing before him was the man from room 206, his skeletal frame barely concealed by the hospital gown. His grin widened, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. "Run," the man whispered. Stephen did. The forest was endless. No matter how far he ran, the trees seemed to shift, twisting to keep him trapped within their labyrinth. The figures moved closer, their fingers brushing against his skin, their whispers turning to screams. Then, the ground gave way. He plummeted into darkness. Stephen woke up to the sound of a heart monitor beeping steadily. His eyes fluttered open to the familiar sight of the hospital ceiling. His chest ached, his limbs felt heavy. A nurse leaned over him, smiling. "You had quite the fall, Mr. Carter. You've been out for hours. We found you unconscious in the woods, outside the hospital. How did you even get there?" Stephen's mouth was dry. His memory swirled like a nightmare, disjointed and terrifying. "Claire," he croaked. The nurse's smile faltered. "Who?" Stephen's blood ran cold. "There's no one here by that name." Outside the window, the tree line loomed, dark and unyielding, and from the shadows, something watched. Night shift. Stephen rubbed his eyes, startled by the shrill alarm echoing inside his head. The emergency room at the old hospital where he worked the night shift had become unexpectedly busy that night, but the strangest part was the calls coming from room 303 and the unidentified patient record that had appeared in the hospital system. The head nurse, Claire, approached him with a tablet in her hand. "This patient isn't in the records, Stephen, but the room shows as occupied," she said, her voice trembling. Stephen suppressed his unease, nodded, and made his way toward the old corridor where room 303 was located. That part of the hospital was nearly abandoned. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting brief moments of darkness, and heavy breathing sounds echoed from within. He slightly pushed the door open. A shadow shifted on the bed inside. A pale, frail man fixed his gaze on Stephen. "You found me, but it's too late," the man whispered. Stephen tried to step back, but an invisible force behind the door pulled him inside. The door slammed shut. He was alone. The man's eyes glowed like empty voids. "They are coming," he murmured. A hand touched his shoulder from behind. It was Claire. But suddenly, her face changed. Her eyes were gouged out. Her mouth stretched open, and a deafening scream erupted from within. Stephen screamed and threw himself against the door, forcing his way back into the corridor. The whispers and the sound of predatory footsteps chased him. He sprinted down the corridor, aiming for the hospital's exit. But as he stepped outside, the hospital courtyard was gone. Instead, he found himself in the middle of an endless forest. Dry branches cracked under his feet. Shadows shifted in the dark. He gasped for breath. Turning back, he expected to see the hospital, but it was no longer there. A deep laughter echoed. "You're one of us now, ... Stephen opened his mouth to scream, but long gaunt figures emerged from the forest, moving toward him. There was nowhere to run. A nightmare that had begun in a hospital was now ending in the depths of a dark forest. Shivering, Stephen took a step back. As the figures approached, indecipherable whispers filled his ears. "You don't belong here, but you can never leave now, ... A dry branch snapped beneath his foot, and all the figures suddenly froze. Stephen stood still. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a glimmer of hope, but then, the shadows lunged at him. A hand gripped his throat and threw him hard onto the ground. The soil beneath him felt damp, but strangely warm, almost as if he had fallen onto something alive. Stephen opened his eyes and saw the trees bending toward him. The sky above was an empty void, devoid of stars. A tall, skeletal figure emerged from the shadows, its hollow, glowing eyes fixed on him. "You will be fun to play with," it said in a low, chilling voice. Stephen tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. As the entity came closer, the shadows around him began shifting, morphing into screaming faces. "There is only one way out of here, ... the figure said, extending its hand. Stephen took a deep breath, but instead of air, thick smoke filled his lungs. He had no idea how long he had been in the forest, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again.